All right, let's get to it. The latest hearing on gun control in Illinois was the first hearing about House Bill 5855 from State Representative Bob Morgan to ban certain types of semi-automatic weapons and magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. And actually, if you look at that legislation, I went ahead and picked out all of the named firearms. There are around 100 semi-automatic pistols, shotguns, and rifles that are explicitly named. And if you follow me on Twitter, just search Bishop on Air. If you scroll down a bit, you'll see the article there about all of the different guns that are named in that legislation. So we expect more hearings, but the first hearing yesterday focused on a resolution about the Highland Park mass shooting, but it also held public comments only from victims of gun violence and those advocating for more gun control. Now, that was yesterday's hearing. No opponents were heard, despite more than 19,000 opposition slips being filed in opposition to the legislation. Now, I'm anticipating that we're actually going to hear from opponents of the measure Thursday when another hearing takes place. All of this lining up for Morgan to try to get his bill banning certain types of weapons across the finish line before the next General Assembly is seated come January 10th. So I want to hear from you as well at 217-629-7970. That's the phone number here with Springfield's Morning News on WMAY, where you can sound off about your reaction to the proposal to ban certain types of firearms. We really didn't hear much substance about the bill yesterday. Instead, we heard an emotional appeal from people who have been shot. They heard from a victim who survived the mass shooting out of Highland Park, but they also heard from victims who've had children shot and killed in regular gun violence in Chicago, and we'll hear some of those voices. But again, I want to hear from you at 217-629-7970. Your thoughts on this proposed legislation. So let's go ahead and get right on into it. The hearing opened up with a resolution, and we'll hear a little bit of that resolution from State Representative Bob Morgan. But several lawmakers who were, number one, lobbyists for more gun control before they became lawmakers, and number two, sitting on a working group behind closed doors crafting legislation to prohibit the sale of certain types of weapons and ammunition magazines. They took a moment to express what they want to see happen with gun control in Illinois. One of those was State Representative Denise Stonebeck. She laid out her thoughts and what she wants to see happen when it comes to more gun control in Illinois. Here's some of what she had to say yesterday at the hearing on HB 5855.
I am a strong supporter of the Protect Illinois Communities Act. We need to pass an assault weapons ban, a large capacity ban on magazines, and all of the other components of this great bill. And we need to do more because it's still not enough. We absolutely need to look at strengthening our permit to purchase, our FOID card system with mandatory fingerprints, and also look at the Illinois Domestic Violence Act and strengthen the gun removal portion of that. It's just some clarifications. And we also need to do a lot more to strengthen and implement our firearms restraining order law.
So again, that was Denise Stonebeck, who laid out more what she wants to see happen beyond just banning certain types of assault weapons. Others took time before the voices were heard on a resolution saying that they need more gun control in the state of Illinois. And then we get to the resolution that recognizes the Highland Park mass shooting on Independence Day. And Representative Bob Morgan reading that resolution to the committee yesterday, and he lays out that there was a lot of effort to respond to it, and also names the victims here are just some of what Bob Morgan read during yesterday's committee hearing on that House resolution.
Whereas community emergency response team, CERT members, and community volunteers rushed to the scene and bravely worked side by side with fire and police personnel and medical professionals, helping to save lives through their quick action. And whereas law enforcement officers from Highland Park and hundreds of others throughout the state of Illinois at all levels of government worked together to quickly secure downtown Highland Park and later apprehend the suspect. And be it further resolved that we especially remember the lives Catherine Goldstein, Irina McCarthy, Kevin McCarthy, Stephen Strauss, Jacqueline Sunheim, Nicholas Toledo Zaragoza, and Eduardo Uvaldo.
And there were dozens that were injured in that mass shooting, with the individual who is suspected of doing so having purchased weapons legally. And those legal purchase of weapons happened with a FOID card that was obtained legally. Despite local police issuing clear and present danger warnings to state police about the individual suspect, they believe used a semi-automatic rifle to fire, 80 shots within 1 minute, injuring dozens and killing 7. So obviously there's a lot of emotion there. And Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering was also at the committee hearing yesterday speaking to this resolution, but not just to the resolution. She also laid out what she wants to see happen with more gun control passed by the Illinois State House.
Law enforcement agencies continue to explore alternative strategies to better secure public events. And after a mass shooting, businesses are often faced with insurmountable challenges as they try to recover and rebuild with traumatized employees and customers. Why is it acceptable to expect 12.7 million people to live in perpetual fear that someone with a weapon designed for war might commit mass violence at any moment? Is access to combat weapons more important than living freely in our communities? What civilized nation allows this type of ongoing mass violence, or worse, embraces it as part of our culture? I recognize that restricting access to assault weapons and large capacity magazines won't stop all gun violence, but banning weapons of war is one common sense step we can take, and it's worth it if we can just save one life.
So again, Nancy Rotering, who really made a national splash, making these pronouncements that we need to ban assault weapons after this Highland Park mass shooting. Highland Park already bans assault weapons in the city limits. And whether or not Illinois bans them, you're still going to have them in this country because other states are not going to ban them. So interesting to see what exactly the trajectory is here in Illinois. But again, yesterday was a subject matter hearing. They passed the resolution that recognizes Highland Park. There's no gun control in that resolution. It just recognizes Highland Park and the mass shooting that happened, the first responders and the victims. But then they got into the subject matter of the proposal to ban certain types of weapons and magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. I'd love to hear your thoughts, 217-629-7970. We've also got some comments I want to hear and share with you from some victims of gun violence. So we'll get to that next here with Springfield's Morning News on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News and Talk. It is now
6 till 9 on 92.7 WMAY.
We are live weekdays from 6 to 9 here with Springfield's Morning News on 92.7 FM. You can also listen live at WMAY.com. But we also do some live streaming videos where you'll see them posted on YouTube, Rumble, but also live directly to Facebook. So join us each and every weekday morning on WMAY. And I'd love to hear from you at 217-629-7970 about the legislation to prohibit the sale of certain types of semi-automatic weapons. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll be able to see the entire list of all of the guns that are listed in that legislation. But the bill also prohibits anyone under from 21 and under, unless they're enlisted in the armed services, from applying for Illinois' firearm owner's identification card. If you're not familiar with that, out of state, it's a ID that's essentially issued by Illinois State Police. The legislation would also require, if you do have semi-automatic rifles, for instance, after the effective date of this legislation, if it goes into effect, you would be required to register your firearm with Illinois State Police and have to pay $25 for the right to do that. And all future sales would be prohibited. We didn't really hear yesterday any of the real substance of the legislation legislation, HB 5855 from State Representative Bob Morgan. We only heard from gun victims, those who've lost children to gun violence, those who've been shot in mass shootings, those who are advocating for this bill. But again, we didn't get to the nitty-gritty specifics. Expecting that to happen Thursday at the second in this series of hearings with an Illinois House committee, delving into this proposal with State Representative Bob Morgan, aiming to get it passed before they come back for the new General Assembly January 11th. So he wants to get it passed as early as the first week of January, which is just in a few weeks here. But yesterday at the hearing, they did hear from some gun violence victims and survivors. One is a survivor who lost her child. This is Jackie Algie from Chicago's South Side. She did highlight the disparities there are in the response to a mass shooting in Highland Park versus a response to the mass shooting that happens in her community practically on a daily basis. And here is what Jackie had to say about that disparate response that too often is felt by Chicagoans who are rocked by gun violence regularly.
But I remember that day, as most of us do, on July 4th of this year, when the tragedy occurred in Highland Park. And my heart went out to them. It continues to. And I continue to pray for them. But at the same token, in Black communities around this city and state, there were 10 in this city, 10 Black kids that were shot and killed that day. There were 62 that were shot and injured. And yet the reaction and the result of what has come from that reaction, both from a local, state, and federal perspective, is far surpasses what we've been given and what has happened to us and to our children and our families and our communities on both the southwest sides, north sides, and throughout this state in communities of color.
So you can hear the frustration there about the lack of having a lot of outpouring of support for minority communities that are regularly rocked by gun violence. But after a mass shooting in Highland Park, then you see a full court press to try to prohibit the sale of certain types of weapons. Now, Jackie Algie did support banning weapons, but she pointed out that that disparity. Also, you have another individual who is a trauma worker. And this is an interesting conversation that was started by Imad Sadeh. He's a trauma worker. He talked about how guns are just one issue, and instead you also need to take another issue up, and that's a holistic approach to dealing with mental illness. And here's some of what Saeed said yesterday during the House committee and talking about House Bill 5855.
Something has to be done on the other side. Washburn stood high and long on 31st and Kedzie that gave young men in these disadvantaged communities a trade where they could move on and live a decent life that no longer exists. We need to invest in these communities. There's a problem, an illness that's not or has been neglected, and it still is neglected, and that is mental illness. These communities are suffering from historical trauma that is passed down from generation to generation. And I'll quote, not word for word, Mr. Frederick Douglass, who has stated that it is easier to raise a grown man from a child rather than to wait for him to break when he's a man and try to fix him. And that's what goes on, is we're waiting for stuff to happen and then try to fix that problem when it does happen, when we see it coming from way down the road. Thank you very much.
So interesting perspective there from a couple of people who aren't from Highland Park, but are from the inner city of Chicago, highlighting the problems they see with all of this. Now, as things ramp up, you've got the possibility of some lawsuits in the Illinois State Rifle Association, putting the call out for individuals who want to secure their rights. You got to give, they say. You have to donate to organizations that are going to file lawsuits. And they point out, the Illinois State Rifle Association, that they have only a very small fraction of the number of members of those who are actually firearm owners identification card holders. And they say if they had all, even just maybe 10% of all FOID card holders paying dues to the State Rifle Association, they'd have millions of dollars at hand. They released this video yesterday at isra.org. If you haven't seen this, ISRA, Illinois State Rifle Association, isra.org. They're putting the call out to get more donations. And here is one of the officials from ISRA.
They would say, repeating their mantra, "We only want common sense gun reforms." Yeah, well, dust off your checkbook, because what you're going to get is registration. I'm David Lombardo, Vice President of the Illinois State Rifle Association. I've been talking about this for years. They're coming for your guns. I've said it in just about every speech I've given, many of the articles I've written, every student I've taught, and on my weekly radio show on AM 560. I have been warning people that they're coming for your guns, and now they are. House Bill 5855, the Protect Illinois Communities Act, is an arrogant, bold-faced lie to the public. It won't protect squat. But the radical leftists in Springfield aren't interested in protecting your family. They're only interested in subjugating those individuals who think independently and dislike the radical agenda they're shoving down our throats.
It goes on from there, and again, they put out the call for people to donate to the Illinois State Rifle Association, and you can find more information at isra.org. We will be talking much more about this in the days and weeks ahead, and of course, you can always call in live and local at 217-629-7970. So look forward to more conversations about this, and we will also be reviewing the hearing that happens Thursday at an Illinois House Committee, and I expect that that's when we could hear opposition voices. But no opposition voices were heard at the committee yesterday. It was just gun violence victims and advocates advocating for the passage of an assault weapons ban in Illinois by redefining hundreds of semi-automatic weapons and magazines as assault accoutrements and banning the possession and sale of those. But a lot more to be said about all of this. It is Springfield's Morning News on 92.7 WMAY, Springfield's News.